You know, that's like just your opinion, man.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are back. The new and improved, well, new and exactly the same Audio Opinion Show with dueling hosts, Brian and Andy, or Brian and Andrew, just so we keep it not confusing. Welcome, everybody. Tonight, we're going to be talking about audio. Everybody has to have an opinion. Everybody has to talk. And Brian, say your bit or do your poll.
Do my thing. So the first thing we always start out with is a poll. And just because we like to make things easier for people, we start with an easy one. So the first one is we're going to launch the poll. I'm going to read it out for the people at home. So it is weirdly about the Princess Bride. So randomly, Princess Bride. So in the closing credits, what character is Robin Wright credited as? Is she credited as Princess Buttercup? Is she credited as just Buttercup? Is she credited as the Princess Bride? Is she credited as Fair Maiden? Or lastly, trick question again, and I'm really annoyed with you, Brian. So these are our options. Vote often, vote early. I am not allowed to vote because I am the host. And so
perhaps most importantly, is this an anonymous poll?
It is actually, and good point. Actually, that's a really good point. I don't think I've ever mentioned that before, but it does not show me who votes which way. I think I've got, yep, I think we've got everybody because there's a bunch
not quite.
Of
There's going to be two more.
Oh, there we go. Boom.
There we go. That's everybody.
All right. So I'm going to hit end poll, and I'm going to share the results. And the results, according to the poll, is that she's credited as Buttercup. Unfortunately, that is not correct. Oh. The last credit in the credits says, and introducing Robin Wright as the Princess Bride. She is credited as, and Jason is like so happy because he got that. He's like, I knew that one.
Hey, I want to show you guys something though. I actually had Robin Wright on my malt last month. See if you can see here.
Nice. Oh. Nice. We are officially not worthy.
I was I forgot all about her until you just said her again. I'm like, oh yeah, that was completely right. I'll always remember her as Jenny from Forrest Gump.
Also a pretty good Jenny. All right, so let's go ahead and figure out what we're going to be talking about tonight. So what are we going to be talking about tonight? We're going to have 4 choices. I'm going to read them off to you now. Really, really basic stuff. First one is sampling rates, 48K versus 98 versus 96K versus 192. If you're a Digicode guy or whatever, does it matter? Do we care? What do you like? Second possibility, plugins versus the real thing. We'll be talking about opinions if there's a difference. Do you care? What's your preference, etc. Third option, do today's PA systems sound, quote, too good, unquote? And lastly, is old school just, quote, old, or is it actually still relevant? So some of those old school gear, some of that old school techniques, some of the old school ways of mixing, whatever it is that you think of as being old school, is it just old and we should move on? Or do you think it's still relevant? And I'm going to guess on how many people are going to vote based on the color of everyone's hair, color or presence of everyone's hair. But I have 9 votes. I think that's close to everybody.
We need 2 more, I think.
Well, I can't vote. So I think I will say it's close enough that I can call it. So I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share it with everybody. And apparently the consensus tonight is we're going to talk about being old. Is old school, this was actually my question because I have actually given this quite a bit of thought, but is old school just old and we should move on, or is it still relevant? Is there still some relevance to be had? So I'm going to jump in first and give my 2 cents, my opinion about this, and part of the reason why I threw that even in as an option is I see this a lot when I read when I read articles, sometimes in Live Sound International and other magazines by various mixers and whatever, a lot of times I see a lot of the approaches of more seasoned veterans following a very simple path of almost no plugins, very little processing. They like a very direct microphone to speaker approach, and newer and younger, let's just call it that, engineers moving more and more towards, lots of plugins and lots of complexity and lots of parallel compression because they can. And that just got me to thinking. And I do think that we have lost something with the advent of having so many options readily available. Like you can say, oh, I want to put a rack of 14 different things on my lead vocal, and it doesn't take up an entire rack in the truck to do it. Like I can just, pull out another Waves plugin. I can pull out another thing and manipulate it. And I think the music has lost some energy as a result.
Just because you can, should you? Yeah.
Right. But I also am well aware of the fact that I have plenty of gray hair, and that may be coloring my opinion. So that's my opinion. Does anybody want to weigh in before Andrew just picks somebody? Go, Dave.
I'll jump in because I assume
Go ahead, Jay.
the youngest one here. So I'll get that out of the way. Me and Ed are probably in the gun for it, right? How old are you, Ed?
I think it's you.
I think it's me. 34.
You got me by a few years. You're youngest.
Old school is still absolutely relevant. Absolutely, to the point where I credit so many people that were my mentors to my success, and they stuck to the old school. I run into kind of younger guys now that don't understand inserts, like physical inserts. They can't wrap their head around it. I had a guy actually send me a picture of a patch bay in the back of a truck in a mall, asking me, what is this? I was told I need to set this up. Everything that we do now, the way consoles are designed now, the way signal flow is designed, is all based on those old school principles. They are time tested. They exist for a reason, and they are still the core fundamentals of everything we do. Now, I truly believe being able to adapt, use the technology we have to its fullest abilities should be accepted and not overlooked. But anybody that just wants to disregard the old school methods or act like they're not fundamental to the success, they're not going to last at all. I'm probably the biggest advocate of old school in my generation. So that's my 2 cents.
I got to agree with Jay, but I have to say that in agreeing with Jay, I am totally happy with modern equipment that doesn't require tip ring sleeve inserts.
Yep.
I'm very happy that I can put as an afterthought in the middle of a show, add some processing onto a channel without having somebody.
How do I get my monitor bus onto a channel? Like I can't patch it to do it. Well, just route out the back and return onto a channel. Return on the channel. You can do that? Yeah. You can return on a channel for sure.
Although a horrible price of all of that is the world thinking an 1/8-inch TRS is a pro audio connector.
Yeah. Did you guys see the guy on, it was like Live Sound USA 2 days ago, who asked for a 100-foot 1/8-inch cable? People were, why?
I did see that, and it was one of those like, are you trolling, or is this a real question? Because it was really, because then farther down, and again, I'm picking on somebody, I don't even remember his name, so sorry to whoever this, but and then farther down, it's like, oh no, the audio guy wants to use fiber, and I'm like, well, that didn't really get better. Like that doesn't make any sense either. Like, instead of using the 1/8 to 1/4 inch adapter that's 100 feet long, we're going to convert to fiber? Like what? Anyway.
I was told back in the day with Dugan cards, before they were just on consoles, my mentor was like, I want to make sure you can mix a show without a Dugan before we install the Dugan card. And I don't know, I think that's kind of fundamental, right? End of my 2 cents today. I'm in a great mood today.
I did say, I will say,
Thank you.
I did notice that Mr. Clark was in a better mood this week than he was last week. And that's a good thing, because you in a
Means
good
he's
mood
happy.
is good. It means good things are going well. So that's
Well,
all.
that's right.
I got off probably one of the best commercial shoots I've done so far yesterday, and it was just ended on a high note. So I couldn't be in a better mood.
Fantastic. That's what I like
Thank you all for dealing with me at my worst.
to hear. Jason, what's something to say about old versus new?
Sure. I mean, old, it formed the sound and the standards that we all aspire to maybe not reproduce, but maybe we got in our dreams that we want to improve upon it, but it's still our reference. It'll always be our reference because it was so good. So it's unfair to call it old. Let's call it original.
Original. That's
We-
better.
We all talk about
yeah.
how great some of those old shows sounded because the bands were so good and the gear wasn't as good, but it was used properly and it worked, you know?
Sure.
Then we start with point source, and then it went to line array, and now everybody are kind of shifting back into point source.
Well, I think one of the things that you have to look at here is the simple fact of fundamentals are fundamentals, regardless, old, new, whatever. The fundamentals have to be right from the beginning. Now, with that, I'll also add the basic KISS principle: keep it simple, stupid. So it's great that we have plugins and we have all this stuff you can add. And it's like, great, I want this channel to sound like an SSL, even though I'm on a Yamaha. Well, great, you can do all that. But just because you can do it doesn't mean you have to, and do it in the right places at the right time. There's also some really, really cool new tricks coming from kids that I'm like, oh, hey, if I route this way and this, blah, 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 whatever it may be, I'm like, oh, I've never, being the older guy, never looked at it that way. So there's new things to learn, but the basics are the same. The fundamentals are still the same.
Well, and
Yeah, you know
also when I say that, I also mean that the flaws in the old stuff, like the engineers were all looking to build linear sounding equipment, but they had the limitations of their technology at the time. And accidentally, Fairchild 660 distorts in such a way that it sounds amazing. The engineer was probably aghast. The engineer that designed it was probably aghast the first time he heard someone put one of those into clipping. Whereas the listener goes, wow, this sounds enormous. Same thing with LA2As and all those unique original pieces of equipment. It's not that they were textbook better at their jobs. Their flaws gave them character that are pleasing.
To your
Very good.
point, David, on the kids thing, I've seen it with some like more modern technologies, like Riedel, for instance. When Riedel was brand new, we had to actually draw out digital circuitry in the system to make like side tone work or make an IFB work. Like we actually had to design a digital version of a circuit board with components to make it work. Now it's just draw. And so all of our brain power was used to just get the system up and running. And now these kids can take that same system, drop those features, and they don't, their brain and their creativity is open to fix like workflow and these things that we didn't have the bandwidth for because we were just trying to get everything to work, you know. And it is like there's some brilliant young folks out there that are doing things that, you know, I know like there's things that I wouldn't even think of.
I 100% agree. Yeah. I mean, the new concepts are routing things different ways without it ever leaving, whether it be Riedel or a console or whatever else. And you're like, that's kind of really cool. So it kind of breaks that, I don't know, fourth wall, so to say.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, I never would have envisioned that, but it's awesome that you can do it. Yeah.
So let me throw a question out there, because Ed and I had this discussion the other day, and I spend way too much of my life doing black box DSP or QSys program, things like that, which is, at what point does the classic input bus output structure of the traditional analog console, to what degree is that timeless, and at what point does it provide a limiting framework that going to more of a object-based model gives you more flexibility?
That's a really good question. It's something, it's a point that's always bothered me, that the capabilities of digital consoles could be such that you have inputs, you have outputs. Connect anything to any which way in any order you want. This should all be possible. But I think to get manufacturers, rightly so, decided that they needed to work on the analog model to get people comfortable with using them, because it would be too much for somebody to understand. But I think we're getting to the point where this should be possible now. Why do we talk about matrices and groups and mixes and things like this? Why isn't it just a whack of inputs and a whack of outputs? Anything could be patched to anything. Any output can go to any other output. That should all be possible. You shouldn't have to decide ahead of time how you're going to configure your board. Just
It pretty much is on a Studer.
Yeah.
There are
Is it
so many
SSL?
layers of
Yeah.
patching on the inside of a Studer.
Mhm.
It just, I mean, the user is never really meant to see it. I mean, their business model has always been that you specify what console you want, they build it, they commission it, and you use it. But in the world of like Broadway rental houses like ProMix and Mask and Sound Associates, I mean, consoles have to be reconfigured completely every time they go out, because every show's got different requirements. And the first time I used a Studer, it took me 3 weeks to get it configured, just because it was so complex in it. But the power, the power of what you could do with it was just blew me away.
I think you have to have a balance between a pre-designed workflow so that it will function, and the ability to change things around. So you can still make it an analog style mixing board, but there's no reason that you can't say, I want the EQ in front of the compressor, or I want this many compressors, or I want this to be in this order. But they do probably have to, they can't really do it the way, like if you have a DSP where you can just drag and drop and put wires in and things like that, because you can get yourself into trouble. So I think they want to protect you a little bit from getting yourself into loops and things like that.
But in that situation, you had to get into that troublemaking level.
Okay.
Because that's how you reconfigured the console for each show. And that's why it took me 3 weeks, because I was on the phone every day with Paul Shorter at Studer technical support, having him explain one more thing that I did wrong.
Well, some of that's just like you're saying, it's the knowledge and the education base. And in that, like these, I'll say these new kids, I'll call them kids because I'm old enough, are learning things in a different way. When I go back, and I'm even going to go back to like Brian of talking about audio flow and everything else, and learning that analog's a great way to learn it. And I think that structure has to be there, but the fact of digital and everything else you can do just expands that. But if you don't have that basic, and it's also just an education of, and that knowledge base of whether you're in the analog and learning that part of it, or you're all the way up to the part where Mac is, where you're sitting in front of a Studer and you can do anything anywhere, and you got to figure out not only how to do it, but how to not wrap myself into a cluster.
Yeah, you have to put
enough rope
guardrails
to hang
up.
yourself, you know. And it's also a balance of cost versus simplicity of use versus purpose versus operator skill. I mean, you put a Studer in front of a church volunteer tech, and that's a formula for trouble. Whereas the X32 is perfect for that, because it limits them. It doesn't give them the rope to hang themselves.
But it is interesting that the new model, and I do believe that we're absolutely, from a, the conversation now has moved a little bit more towards, new ways of mixing versus old ways of mixing. And for sure, the way that we're approaching things now is becoming more and more efficient. If you think about it, like old school analog mixing console, like typical front of house rig, 3/4 of the mix buses weren't even used. You were just dragging them around in the truck. Like, you never even turned them on, because you basically were like sending a couple of inserts and stereo bus. But, you threw it in monitor land, and all of a sudden all that stuff mattered. Or there may be whole bunch of EQ bands that never leave Unity, like they're just straight up because you never bought, you never used them. But you couldn't say, I want to take these 3 bands from this channel and add them to the lead vocal, so I'll have 7 bands of parametric EQ. Like, you couldn't do that. Let's let the crazy talk. Like, so from an efficiency standpoint, or anybody that's worked for a sound company back in the analog days, you had these big standardized racks that you would like show up with, whether you needed all that stuff or not. And the idea of, I need 3 channels of compression and I just load that into my desk, instead, oh, now I need 47 channels of compression and I load that into my desk on a thumb drive. I mean, the efficiency, I think, is amazing. What I think is the slippery slope is, because I can, I will. Because I can put 47 things on the lead vocal, I will put 47 things on the lead vocal. And last thing, and then I'll stop hogging the conversation. I did a show a few years back where I watched a band engineer on a Avid desk, and the only thing he looked at for the entire show was his screen. Meanwhile, there's a whole show going on stage, like, and they were doing some improvising. It was kind of a cover band, but they were like, oh, we're going to launch into it. So there's a guitar solo that's going for like 3 minutes and you still can't hear it because the engineer's staring at the plugins on his screen, tweaking his threshold of his dynamic EQ, like whatever it was, he was tape saturation or whatever it was. And I'm just like, the fader on your console needs to be moved by 3 dB up because I can't hear the freaking guitar. Like,
anybody who's not part of the show, that idea that it's just me, I'm just going to do my thing and then they're doing something else up there. You need to be a musician, be part of that whole show, watching it, seeing what's happening, be dynamic with it. It's horrible when you see those sort of mistakes like that, where the person's clearly not engaged with what's going on stage. And as a musician, if I was on stage, I don't think I'd want that guy to be part of my crew, because he's really not.
Can you turn it? No, my screen says it's fine. My screen says it's perfect. No, listen. Can you please? No, the screen says, the math, it says it's perfect.
But Brian, to your point, until those specific consoles came out, or let me rephrase that. As those consoles rolled out and people began to realize they could manipulate them, we saw a genre of mixers disappear. And we saw a new genre of mixers reappear with alongside them a system tech, because they were probably studio mixers or live mixers that could pivot and use those tools. That along with better PA systems allowed bands to, I remember a couple of very specific bands when that console was brand new, like the first couple of years, that it was the first time I had actually heard the band sound like a record. Like, no band before that really sound like, it was pretty much impossible to make the band unless it was like a Bob Seger or like just a straight up rock band. Anything fancy, like, strong chorusing on vocals, or, unless it was like a really, really high dollar A act, they weren't going to sound like the record. So now your B acts could sound like the record if the guy knew how to use the tools, and I think it did more better than harm in terms of quality of shows and music shows in general, I think.
But do you want to go to a live show and just hear the record? I can sit at home
it's
and
never
put the record
just
on.
the record, because they're like playing, but like, yeah, good point. But
I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Well, I agree, and I could get very concrete about and give specific examples, but this is one of the parts where like old me shakes fist at cloud kind of thing, because I do think it's like we spent decades trying to achieve, we just want this to sound as good as they sounded in the studio. And then we got there, and I feel like it was like getting to the top of Everest. Then it was like, now what do we do? we're here now.
Well, and at the same
like there's
time,
nothing to look at because we're here. Like, and it was almost, yeah. And Jason, I kind of know where you're going, so I'll absolutely jump to, but you know, it just, I don't know. As one of those people who was trying desperately to get there, so I totally get the compulsion. Like we were trying so hard to make it sound like that. And then
I'd like to hear a show that got there. You know, I'm still desperately wanting to see a show there. I can go, God, that sounded good. It doesn't, and not to be fussy, but just, you know, being in these venues that sound so horrible, and these shows where the sound guy just doesn't give a crap. He's just clipping it, or it's no vocal, you know, all these just basic problems. I'm not talking about subtleties of reverbs or anything like that. I'm just talking about listenable, you know. I mean, I see so many shows that are just completely unlistenable, and to the point of I feel like I want my money back, and it's depressing. So
we went through
got
this,
to that thing. I don't know.
This crossfade in history where the acts that could afford the state-of-the-art technology that could make the players on stage sound like they did in the studio, this crossfade of the actual musical skill of the people standing on stage was fading downward.
Because the tools were better.
The tools were better. We're more accurately reproducing what they're doing. It's not being covered up with a bunch of with a bunch of accidental mud anymore. And now we're really revealing what these people are doing. And so, and in answer to David, right, if it's Pink Floyd on stage, I'm perfectly happy hearing the record. Right? So everything's got to line up. The magic has to happen on so many levels.
Yeah, but okay, I'm still I gotta throw it in. If I'm hearing Pink Floyd on stage and they sound like the record, I still want to hear David Gilmour do a longer guitar solo because it's live.
Indeed.
What do you think, Ed?
And I'm sorry, and I will throw to Ed. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting host choice.
Oh my God.
But using Pink Floyd is an interesting example because Pink Floyd has been an elaborate, ridiculous stage show since they first started. They have emphasized, you know what, we're going to play the record. We don't want you to get bored with that. So we're also going to give you a whole bunch of stuff to look at, which I think was kind of like looking forward to where most of our live shows are now. Sorry, I interrupted. Ed, go.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt too, because you just said something that I keep thinking about, the idea that as the bands get older, as the bands get older and they can't sing the way they used to, or they can't play the way they used to, the tribute acts usually are the ones that you start to go, hey, those guys sounded like they used to sound back in the day. And those are the ones that for me are so a lot of times more enjoyable than the old acts who can't really pull it off anymore. There should be a time limit. Certain bands should go, okay, we can't really do this anymore. We shouldn't be playing on stage anymore. And yet they do, because they can make
with
money.
sound guys too.
Hey now, wait. I feel seen, and I didn't like that.
I see.
Over to you, Ed.
So with this old school, new school thing, I mean, I kind of look at myself where I am is I came in kind of a mid school because I learned on analog gear, but Pro Tools was starting to become very affordable when I was kind of in college the first time around and learning about this stuff. ADAT machines were on the studio side were kind of the thing. And then digital consoles were shortly behind, but they weren't affordable. So guys on the low end like me couldn't afford, because there was no X32 at $2,000, entry, it was, 10, 12 years after I got into doing audio before an LS9 at, $10,000 was available, and actually the first show I ever mixed on a digital console was on a Mackie TT24. If anybody's ever even seen one of those, it's like way ahead of its time, as far as being that low budget, throw kitchen sink features into an affordable unit. Not a good sounding one, but it was, something that I could mix on when I was in my early 20s, and that was what was available. But I really, and Justin alluded that he and I were talking about this the other day, and even on the show that some of us participated in last week, I talk about analog consoles as a teaching tool all the time, so that, as Dave mentioned, the fundamentals, learn those things, and then you can have your mind blown by all of the possibilities that are opened up in the digital world. And so much, I'll echo some of what was said, was like why do you have to do something just because you can? And I think if we look at where some of those trends come from, these new school, as somebody called them kids earlier, are picking up these tricks. You know, they're looking at guys like Dave Rat and Pooch and like looking at these insane routings that these guys are doing. Those guys are so deeply routed in old school, and they only know how to do the crazy stuff they're doing because they have that fundamental knowledge and they know how to turn the new tools into something amazing. But on the flip side, if you look at some of the user forums for maybe some of these lower end digital consoles, and you look at the questions and then the knowledge base of answers, you quickly realize that so many people do not know any of these fundamentals, but they're attempting to do these crazy routing things that they read about in a magazine or heard about. And they're having very, very deep positions on certain things. I mean, go read a forum on Facebook about aux-fed subs, and you'll see people who are say you have to do aux-fed subs all the time, and then you'll have people who say you never do aux-fed subs, and you'll know which one's a Dave Rat fan and which one's a Pooch fan, because those two guys have put it out there very much what their opinion is, and they've spent decades forming that opinion and that workflow. So it's a whole different thing of like people are running before they can walk, and then taking something they learned or read as gospel. And that's where I think the new school suffers a little bit by not having that fundamental knowledge that some of us old and middle school guys are kind of at, where if you didn't come up with this analog stuff as the only option and learned how to make it work and do the crazy things that you wanted to do, then you've been handed something on a platter, and now you're just like a kid in a candy store grabbing anything and trying to figure it out. To what Mac was saying with the Studers, you know, and I forget who, somebody said it, you know, if you put that church volunteer in front of something that has to be 100% configured every time, the amount of time it'll take them to get ready is going to be, you know, much longer than if they have some digital console that has some structure to it, and you don't have to spend all that time configuring. So some of these consoles, and why I think, I forget who else mentioned it, some of these digitals have, you know, at least some structure in them, is so that you can walk up to it and be ready to go in a few minutes, as opposed to, well, I need an hour just to program so I can get audio from input 1 out to main left right. So there's a lot, you know, to be said for the old school, and there's a lot to be said for the new school. But I think if you don't understand where we came from, then you're not going to know how to get there, because you don't know what you don't know.
In defense of my comments about the Studer, it is a pretty easy console to use, and a pretty low level person should be able to walk up to it and operate it.
I'll defend you here, Mac. When those things, like when the live version, the SR first came out, I had to commission 2 of them for rental, and it took me like a week to figure out how to pass audio through it, and I still couldn't do it because it doesn't ship with the ports labeled. But I blew up 2 iPhones because I had Phantom turned on where I didn't think I had Phantom turned on, trying to get that thing to pass audio. Since then, however, I have found them to be acceptable, because we came up with a stock like setup that looked familiar to most mixers: input channels, buses, auxes, matrices. Then users were less scared to get on it, you know. But when they showed up and the whole thing was blank, they're like, I don't even know how to use this thing, you know. So that bridge between the two, like Ed, you were talking about, like that exists on all consoles. Like an X32 took me way longer to figure out how to patch an input to it than it should have, because
I've never figured it out.
I'm just not that smart. But turns out, like, you know, it seems to be pretty easy for most. So, you know.
And I wasn't trying to pick on the Studer, but, you know, like walk up to a Digico if you've never touched one, or if you come from Yamaha world and you're like, this is a Windows computer inside a console? And, you know, it can be very, very daunting. So
the SSL that I'm currently mixing on is a Windows computer. They just updated it from Windows maybe 7 to 10. Recently, they updated it to Windows 10 embedded. And I have to say I'm Windows allergic, but On the other hand, between last Wednesday when I left work and this Wednesday when I came back to do a gig, they did a firmware update, and it now has as many seaters in it as I want. It's, that was a firmware update, and I'm okay with that.
You're talking with the side panels, right? The cedar.
Yeah, exactly.
We haven't heard from Mr. Lipnick. You have anything to throw into this conversation?
Yeah, and I really like the way you said it, Ed. That was good. To me, the fundamentals of audio, it's a language. And that's what really matters here. I don't care about old school, new school. Well, not to any great degree. And I think part of what we're talking about here is when you're trying to help someone through an audio issue and they're new to the game, if they don't know the language, it's a lot harder. If they don't know signal flow from the microphone all the way through the channel, it's a lot harder. And that stuff was drilled into me. I'm so glad it was drilled into me because it makes troubleshooting so much easier. And the thing with digital consoles that I think we can probably all agree on is that there are so many more traps than there were before there were digital consoles. It's really easy to get into trouble. And I'm sure we've all been there and been scratching our head like, what the hell? I remember I was getting ready for a show and I had done some pre-programming and I got on site and I'm like, well, I see the audio, I can't hear it. And it took me like 10 minutes to figure out, oh, I didn't have the DCA up and it was on another layer, like things like that, which I was just kicking myself after I found it, but I never do that again now. But things like that are really important. And I think that whether you're new to this game or not, you really got to know that those fundamentals of the language, and once you know the language, you can do a lot of other things and experiment, and then you have a basis for it.
How many times have you had the question, how do I set a compressor on a vocal? Well, all these things, if you don't have any basics behind it, how do you answer these questions? You have to say, look, I'm sorry, but you're really going to have to go back and start to understand how some of this stuff works. You're going to need to get some basics. Oh, I don't have time for that. I just want to know what the settings are.
And you're going to have to answer the question about why do you want to put a compressor on the vocal?
Exactly.
You don't have a reason to put it there.
Yeah.
Why are you asking?
And now we're dealing with a world where there are no consoles. It's just an audio interface into Zoom. And then people are like, well, maybe I need a compressor, same thing. Right. It's like, okay, why do you need a compressor?
Andy, something you said just clicked with me. And that's part of the virtual show thing is a lot of people had to learn new skills, right? And one of the most important skills is like computer sciences, because that's basically all of our tools now. Then I was thinking about digital consoles and how systems are more complex and how most operators don't really know how to fix, like if the Windows machine crashes on a Digico or whatever. And but back in the day, like we knew that if that one DN360 wasn't working, that the little relay in there was dirty and you just had to open it up and like drill a hole in it and squirt some stuff in it and then knock it with a screwdriver and now you're off to the races again. Or
don't you love it when you learn that stuff though?
A little thing like with the hot glue gun, because it, the thing always came out, but all of that craft is lost now, or like the little power supply truck, all those little like we knew our gear back then and we knew how to keep it running now. And it was simpler to keep running too. But now, like, something breaks and it's so complicated, we can't fix it. And you just have to get a new one or a new whole component or whatever, and it. So you have
look at all the modern engineers who've never had to hunt down a ground buzz because there's no more analog interface. They don't experience it. They get it on stage, but the rest of us have dug through the back of our racks for an hour before sound check trying to find the one dirty plug that caused everything to buzz. And so there are parts of this art that are going to be lost.
Every
Well, now that's a
workbox
button
that I
and a
see,
plugin.
yeah, pretty much every workbox that I see now, the little compartment with pin one lifts is full because they never come out of the workbox.
It also means they don't get stolen. They don't get stolen.
You obviously
Nobody
haven't
uses them.
interfaced to any video equipment lately.
Well,
Yeah,
I use them all the time.
but you end up like a lot of times when I'm interfacing to video equipment, I've dropped a stage box, and the stage box is plugged into their crap. And so my audio path is on their ground, even if it's completely totally different from mine, like it's on the other end of fiber. Like
But is it, Brian?
Exactly. It's on the other end of fiber.
But it may not be. I mean, digital has almost the same amount of bad ramifications of ground as analog. Only now it just breaks completely.
Exactly. Well, and that exactly, which is why the pin one lifts stay in there. It's one of those you plug it in and you go, now it's not working at all, and why? And then it's a completely different set of problems. But yeah, it's like, the number of what are the IL9s, IL19s, I always forget which,
IL19.
IL19s are all, tons of those in the workbox, tons of pin one lifts in the workbox, like plenty of that stuff, because but now it's like you can never find a freaking Cat 5 feed through. It's completely different set of problems.
Yeah, Ethercon barrels, and why would I need a ground lift? Because everything's Dante on an AVIO. Sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, you think about for myself, the first gig I ever got was because I was the only guy who could figure out how to hook the stuff up or fix it or make it work. It wasn't that I was some great sound man. It was just like, oh, you've hooked up stereos before. Do you know how to make this work? You can plug in, and doing it wrong, and then you figure it out as you go along. And I think to myself sometimes, well, those skills, I don't need any of those skills anymore. But in a way, you kind of do. You kind of still need to know how to troubleshoot. And that's where that skill is universal to everything. You always need to know how to look for the problem and figure out how to get to what's the most likely problem, the most likely thing to troubleshoot. So I don't think you ever lose that skill. Specifically, you don't need to fix a power supply anymore, but you do need to know, I hear this weird sound. What's the most likely thing it's coming from, right? So
that's the biggest thing I see between old school and new school is the ability to troubleshoot what you're doing. If you don't have your old school knowledge, you can't move into the new world and troubleshoot. At least I think so.
Because people lack ingenuity, do you think, Nathan? Because we all did.
No,
I think it's so much of it set up for them, man. Like,
yeah,
what do you guys feel about people selling console pre-config files?
Well, that digital board is all laid out and stuff like this, and you jump right into it. And if there's something wrong in a patch you did, it's going to take you hours. I mean, if you don't have the baseline knowledge, it's going to take you hours to find the basic things in digital. So
the thought of buying someone else's config file is kind of scary.
well,
The CQ sounded good yesterday.
Recipe for disaster, because you have no idea what's going on.
Well, the flip side of that, like when the 5Ds first started coming out and stuff, you're reading all these editorials in the trades going, make sure you wipe the console before you send it back so no one can steal your special EQ.
that sort of thing,
Anybody here ever have somebody hire them and then ask them, can you just dummy proof the console for me for the next guy? How many times have you guys been asked that question? Or we can't pay you for the full week. Can you just set it up for my guy to run?
I have had where I've subbed for people and they've given me their file, and then I tell the band hey, I got the guy's file, everything will be good. They're like, oh, would you actually just start over?
I've worked for organizations where they literally make you sign a thing at the beginning saying anything you do while you're under our employ is ours. So at that point you can go, well, I guess if they want the file, they can have it. But typically that's just such a bad idea. I wouldn't want somebody else's file. It's too hard to figure out what they were thinking when they put it together.
You have no idea what's happening.
No, you're going to make a mess of it.
Well, when the band fires the front of house engineer on the road and they're bringing somebody in the very, very next night who's never heard the band, been behind the console, and so you're running off of the last guy's file. Ugh, terrible. But it happens. And
You have to
as soon
start
as
somewhere.
you have to start somewhere, and as soon as you can, you're trying to create your own file, your own workflow, everything else, and you want to make sure that you separate yourself from the guy who just got fired.
Yeah,
Right, to
first thing you do is do that virtual sound check and sit in your hotel room and try to get your own file together, because
There's a new school thing that's a real great development, the virtual sound check. We didn't have that back in the day. No
That
practice.
was a game changer.
You get a sound check.
Game changer.
Yeah.
We had the text band.
Yep. And your job was on the line, because every time you mixed, your boss was the ones you were mixing. Yeah, that's a real good one.
Yeah,
But
doing sound checks when the bands don't even want to do sound checks, and they never play properly anyway. That was the only time you had a chance to try anything, and it was just.
Well, and that's what I was just going to bring up. When you're a monitor engineer and they hire you in the middle of a tour, and the lead singer will not come to a sound check, a lot of times the previous guy's file is all you've got for your first show or two until you figure out what's going on.
And I feel like, I mean, since digital has happened, I'm not a touring guy. I haven't done a lot of music, but at the end of the day, it's like, you inheriting my show file doesn't turn you into me. So, if I don't worry about you stealing that from me, because you don't suddenly become me. You don't suddenly hear things the way that I do. You don't suddenly respond to changes the way that that's what I get hired to do, or get fired because they didn't like. But either way, the show file is not the thing that I'm concerned about. Like, oh, if you get my file, then I'll never work in this town again. Like, it has never worked that way for me.
Yeah,
I've been telling everybody for years, just a very simple statement, and I'll shut up, but we can all read the manual. There's a manual for everything nowadays, right? But what do you do when it fails? That's really what separates the pros and the Joes. Is shit's gonna happen. The ability to figure it out and have a solution quickly,
and know what's going to fail before it does. Right, man. Predicting that this is not going to work. We're not going to do it this way.
And just because it says it can do it doesn't mean that you should.
The show file will never get rid of or replace that ever. You got to be able to fix it.
Sorry, Matt, were you going to say? Just sorry.
Dave, it was just about the whole thing about people wanting your files. I remember when I was hired to program PM1Ds for Broadway shows, and they were making a big deal about the files. And it was like, I don't care if you take the file, because nobody's ever going to have a console configured the way this one is. So you could load the file into a PM1D. If every port isn't exactly the same as this one, you got bupkis. It's, it's not, the file is nothing. It doesn't, it's what happened with you with that setup. It's not relevant to any other setup.
Yeah, if somebody wants to use it, they're probably not going to be qualified to do the gig.
That's why when we were touring, we'd rather pull up our own truck and bring our own rig in. Just because the house has the same console doesn't mean you can walk up and end up with a show that sounds the way your boss is used to it sounding.
Of course, you'll spend twice as much time just trying to figure out what they did wrong.
Right.
And we've had come into venues where the exact same PA is hanging there, and it's like, can we take it down? We'll put ours up. We'll have it done in half the time, as opposed to try to retune your rig and this sort of stuff. Yeah, totally makes sense.
I have used files though, like to communicate the show, especially in special events, broadcast and corporate, where it's like, hey, like we're going to do the show. Let's talk through my file. You don't use my file, but like, let's talk through it to give you an idea of like, and then I remember too, like, oh yeah, why did I have that weird thing there? And then that other weird thing. Oh, right. Actually, we do have this other thing too you need to know. So I have used it as a communication tool
especially in broadcast. You nailed it there. There's no PA. I've done that tons in OB trucks.
But you're talking about corporate versus broadcast or musical shows. Corporate, you can share the files. You've got your podium mics, your wireless mics, your in and outs for video and so forth. It's pretty standard. So I would think there'd be a little more room to share in corporate show and a lot less proprietary, like this is my file and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
No?
maybe. Yeah, maybe. But I like
We're still cowboys.
Yeah, and there's, I mean, Pete and I specifically have in the last year done, you know, things where I inherited his rig or vice versa, or we were working from the same thing or whatever. Kind of played through a lot of these kinds of things. You know, a lot of times it comes down to trust. There's also just, there's a few things that are very Brianistic that I just do it this way, whether it requires it on the show or not. Brian never uses the stereo bus as an output to the PA, ever. Never do it. I never do it. So somebody walks up to my show and they push the stereo bus up and nothing comes out. They're totally confused because I never, my reasons for that are a whole nother show.
They're going to
But,
drive
you
the
know,
recording into compression on my console.
Yeah, and so it's, you know, so even in simple setups, there's, you know, there's specificity to it. This has been a great conversation. I don't want us to go too long. I'm sorry, Jay, I was interrupting you. Go ahead.
I just said you feed your left and right out of your matrix, and then you send mixes in the matrix, right, rather than taking the stereo bus.
Because the stereo bus is such a convenient output for recording because it always has nice big meters on the meter bridge of the console. So it's very easy to keep track of what's happening in the recording.
Which is actually a perfect segue for workflow, because the answer to your question, Jay, is no. And the answer to what Max said for me is no. I have my own reasons. And again, that just goes to like, even for a simple thing, like, and Mac's not wrong, and Jay, you're not wrong. Like, those are completely valid ways to do it. I have this particular way that I like to do it, and I'm just used to doing it, which I guess really kind of like wraps the whole thing up here. It's like, you know, the old way of doing things informs a lot of what I do now. Some of the stuff that still applies, I hang on to. Some of the stuff that doesn't apply, I've, you know, let go of because it doesn't apply anymore. Doesn't make any sense. I think that the real value is looking at, you know, these are the new tools. What of those is enhancing what I'm doing versus I'm just throwing stuff on it just because it's new and shiny and cool. Anybody have a burning last thought before we roll that magical bean footage?
Well, just on your comment, the stereo bus to recording for me predates digital. That was the way I did it on a 4K as well. So
yeah, and for what it's worth, and in perfect ending, the reason I don't is because when I first started coming up, our medium-sized consoles were Soundcrafts, and the stereo bus had no gain. All the way up was Unity, which meant I couldn't get enough gas into record. I mean, it's just an old habit that has then informed a way that I route stuff to this day, even though the main reason for it doesn't even exist anymore.
right, my stereo bus gets fed by mixed buses 9 and 10, just because that's the way that. So they go to the stereo bus, and that's what the recording feed is.
And I'm doing a show.
Everything else goes to a matrix.
I'm doing a show tomorrow where I inherited Brian's show file, and I changed to that.
Well, if
I do Mac's version. I don't do yours.
Yeah, probably drove him completely crazy because it's like, this is completely not what I do. Yeah, so it's, you know, it's all preference.
Fine.
Anyway,
I use most of it.
Brian,
Well,
if you had my mixer, you just have inputs and outputs. There wouldn't be any left and right bus. It would be whatever you want.
whatever you want.
Someday
I have one
somebody's
thing
gonna
that
make a mixer
isn't
for
new
me.
school or old school,
There
and
you go.
none of us have talked about it yet. Gain structure has not changed at all.
True.
The way we use gain structure, has.
Proper gain structure.
Proper gain.
Okay.
structure.
All right.
Yes.
Now I'm saying timeout because that's a whole nother hour. So just knock it off.
I got time.
We have more shows to come. So if you're watching this live or not live, thank you for watching it. Thanks for hanging out with us. We're gonna say goodbye. As long as Andy is ready to roll that fabulous closing bean footage.
Yeah.
So get that ready to roll, and he's ready to go. So for now, let's say goodbye to our friends at home. Goodbye to our friends at home. I'll go though, right? I don't need to hear a whole record. I've been on before. So
Bye-bye, boys.
Have fun storming the castle.
Think it'll work?
It'll take a miracle.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.